Alright, so quick question before I get started. Show of hands. Are there any Russian operatives in the audience? Nobody? Oh, you back there, good. Can they hear me in Moscow? Can they hear me in Moscow? Excellent. Let's get started. So before I dive in, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself so you understand where I'm coming at this problem from. My name is Meagan Keim. I'm an InfoSec analyst and Russian language nerd. I spent a year studying abroad in Russia on a language immersion program. And while I was there, I purposely avoided English language news sources so that I could further my immersion experience. Now, the unfortunate side effect of that decision was that I was exposed to a huge dose of propaganda. So, while I was in Russia, Russia annexed the Ukrainian region of Crimea, and also began military operations in eastern Ukraine. And at the same time, there was really sharp intensification in information operations. So I wanted to talk to you about all the lessons that came from all of that while I was over there. So first, let me start with some of the fundamental characteristics of Russian information operations and why they're so effective. Russian info ops often takes a grain of truth out of its original context and creates a new false narrative around that small grain of truth. For example, the activities of current and far-right fringe groups in Ukraine have been used to paint all Ukrainians as fascists. This creates a siege mentality for most Russians and greatly lessens the likelihood that they will question the Russian government's actions. More often than not, the intent of Russian info ops is to create expedient narratives and even new realities. One of the most prominent of these themes is, "We're no worse than the West." This is a line that I heard played out over and over again to the point where I became numb to it. One particularly pertinent example of this tactic is that Russia points at U.S. support for separatist Kosovo, which was part of the former Yugoslavia until the late 1990s. Now, Russia uses this as evidence of hypocrisy, saying that since the U.S. supported separatist Kosovo, it should also support what Russia calls Crimean self-determination. Another common strategy is co-opting fringe groups to further push misleading information. For example, thousands of far-right Russian nationalists have volunteered to fight in the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. Now, these volunteer fighters refer to the militants in eastern Ukraine as separatists, or brothers, and they refer to their enemies, the Ukrainian army and government, as fascists. So this demonstrates wholesale adoption and rebroadcast of the Russian state's carefully crafted terminology. In reality, Russia stoked the flames of this supposed separatist movement and has propped it up for years with military and other forms of support. Let's take a step back for a minute so we can better understand what is going on here. Russian information operations can be thought of as large-scale social engineering. Traditional social engineers abuse social and behavioral norms for personal gain. But in the case of Russian information operations, the attackers abuse societal norms for national gain. So how does this work in practice? It's very important to keep in mind that Russian info ops do not refute, rather they subvert and erode Western liberal values. For example, transparency as a value has served as a vector for large-scale social engineering. Specifically, transparency was subverted in the use of WikiLeaks as a front for dumping stolen information and pushing narratives expedient to the Russian government. You can see that Mr. Assange has been a guest on the network RT, which is one of the biggest mouthpieces of Russian information operations. So let's take a closer look at RT. It's the international arm of Russia's propaganda apparatus, and its tactics are a great illustration of large-scale social engineering. RT abuses Western society's value of freedom of speech and freedom of press when it presents itself as a news source and claims to provide an alternative to the Western media establishment. You can see this reflected in its lovely slogan, "Question More." And it may seem like that slogan is encouraging more critical thought, but really all it's doing is making people more likely to accept conspiracy theories. By pitching itself as a supposed alternative to mainstream media, Russian info ops also undermines the credibility of reputable sources of information. Russian info ops both exploit and feed into growing disagreement on what constitutes a credible source of truth and whether or not objective fact is really valuable at all. I happen to think that it is still valuable, but apparently there's some people disagree with me. As is the case with the most effective social engineering campaigns, Russian information operations are tailored to their targets based on reconnaissance. It's important to keep in mind that Russian society generally knows a lot more about American society than vice versa, so this makes us particularly vulnerable. The annexation of the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea perfectly illustrates Russian information operations at work. The annexation of Crimea is one of the first and best examples of Russian military and information operations being completely integrated. The invasion started when Russian soldiers without insignias on their uniforms infiltrated the peninsula and took control of government offices, military bases, and communications infrastructure. At the same time, Russia's info ops pushed the claim that these, quote, little green men, or, quote, polite people, were militiamen and not the members of the Russian military that they were in fact. Russian forces were deliberately referred to in this way to make the situation seem less threatening and less urgent. It also made the operation seem more like support to local residents' desire for self-determination. Now this picture is a real photograph taken at the time of the invasion of Crimea, and you can see that it perfectly illustrates the narrative of the little green men. You can see that a soldier without insignia on his uniform is helpfully handing a cat back to a little boy, and he's armed to the teeth, but, you know, never mind him. He's a polite person. He's not going to harm you. I personally experienced the insidious effects of Russian info ops through a steady diet of Russian-controlled state TV. Now, the coverage on these outlets described the annexation as a, quote, historic reunion, or a, quote, return to Russia. This language was specifically crafted to appeal to domestic audiences and capitalize on common culture and shared Soviet history. Crimea was one of the most popular vacation destinations in the USSR, and it was also home to a key Soviet Navy port. I included this map to show you how close the invaded regions are to Russia, both geographically and linguistically. Now, the darkest red regions, including Crimea in the south and Donetsk in the east, are areas where 75% or more of local residents are native Russian speakers. After the infiltration was complete, state propaganda outlets, both RT and domestic ones, trumpeted the overwhelming and falsified results of the Russian organized referendum in Crimea. The results showed that over 95% of voters supported reunification with Russia. This was a direct subversion of Western values. As people who value the freedom to determine the nature of one's own government, we were primed to think that because the results were supposedly overwhelming, we should respect these people's desire for self-determination. I myself was inclined to believe that Russia's claim on Crimea was legitimate through this thought track. In reality, the referendum was a rigged justification for a foregone conclusion. The entire purpose of the vote was to legitimize the seizure of territory, despite egregious falsifications like turnout figures as high as 123% in some areas. Now, this picture is also a real photograph taken at the time of the referendum in Crimea. The translation of the words at the top is, "On March 16th, we choose." And you can see that the choice being presented here is very, very stark. Basically, voters were either supposed to choose fascism or Russia. So this was a very biased pre-vote environment. So how did I dig myself out of this thought trap? It's all about different ways of thinking. When you're immersed in a culture for long enough, you start to adopt a lot of habits, including mental ones. For me, returning to my home perspective was key. And this happened when I learned about the Budapest Memorandum in a respected right-wing newspaper. The Budapest Memorandum is a 1994 treaty signed by Ukraine, Russia, the US, and the UK. Under this treaty, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal that it had inherited from the USSR, and in return, Russia agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. When I learned this, I realized that the information operations, much like a successful social engineer would do on a smaller scale, had tricked me into not questioning the narratives I was hearing by abusing the value that I assigned to democratic rights. This led to my initial failure to recognize the false narrative as an effort to undermine the international community's response and as a cover for breaking international law. The frame of reference of international law triggered a mental return to my home culture, causing more critical thinking to kick in and allowing me to understand what had actually happened. I've hinted at them already, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the targets of Russia's social engineering. The first set of targets are foreign policymakers, specifically those leading Western states. In the case of Crimea, Russia obfuscated its real goal of keeping Ukraine in its sphere of influence through the seizure of territory. Russia accomplished this in part by pushing the little green men narrative, which made it difficult for policymakers to respond to the situation quickly and effectively. You can't counter what you can't identify, after all. Had Western leaders immediately understood this to be an invasion aimed at destabilizing Ukraine, a much stronger and swifter response would have been more likely. Social engineering worked on policymakers in the early days of the crisis. Enough doubt was introduced to prevent meaningful action until after the fact. This allowed for the creation of a new reality on the ground, and it has proven impossible to roll back. The invasion has been accepted as de facto reality with very few consequences to Russia. Besides, of course, economic sanctions, but the will to maintain those sanctions has waxed and waned. The Budapest Memorandum calls for seeking UN Security Council assistance in the event of a violation of the memorandum, but Russia violated it without meaningful intervention from the international community. Despite the fact that Russian parliament authorized Putin to use force in Ukraine on March 1st, 2014, the UN Security Council only attempted to pass a resolution on Crimea the day before the rigged referendum was held on March 16th. It's important to keep in mind that any society can be targeted in this manner. Russia's info-ops have been aimed at citizens of Russia and other countries to support foreign policy and military goals. In the case of the invasion of Crimea, Russian info-ops shaped Russian public opinion to be overwhelmingly in support of the annexation. My host mom, along with the vast majority of Russians, bought into narratives designed specifically for domestic consumption. She said things like, "Crimea has always been Russian," or "Russians and Ukrainians are one people." Now, it may seem like benevolent calls for unity, but in reality, the implication there is that Ukraine is somehow not a legitimate sovereign state. State-run coverage of Crimea was also highly emotionally charged, or it used the technique of strong affect in social engineering speak. Most prominent among these strong affect techniques was the line that Ukrainians are fascists. Russia's visceral memory of World War II means this stoked strong fears, a siege mentality, and invoked a moral cause to save Russian-speaking brethren from non-existent victimization. This and other narratives also abused Russians' value of collectivism. "We are together" has been the slogan of the day at many rallies held in Russia in support of the annexation. These types of emotionally charged appeals played a key role in convincing Russian citizens to support something that was actually not in their best interests. The annexation led to astronomical federal spending at a time when the economy and federal revenue were both in sharp decline. This tactic of targeting mass groups of citizens can also make it more difficult for political leaders in the West to generate or maintain popular support for policies to counter Russia. Now that we have a better understanding of the problem, I want to talk a little bit about some of the mitigation strategies that have been used to counter Russian disinformation. First, there's an over-reliance on debunking or fact-checking, but that's not going to solve the problem. In fact, it exposes more people to the false narrative. People are also extremely reluctant to question their own beliefs, and a fact check is unlikely to persuade. This is especially true in an environment where there is a lack of general consensus on shared sources of truth. The Russian government isn't even playing on this level. They're not playing a game of right versus wrong, correct versus incorrect. They want to convince people that none of it matters and induce apathy. Apathetic people don't really question what they're hearing, after all. Another common strategy to fight disinformation, pushing out counter-narratives, runs the risk of becoming no better than your adversary, to the point where you end up creating propaganda yourself and feeding into this dynamic of apathy. Adding another narrative doesn't necessarily cancel out the original one. In fact, it can muddy the waters and make people even less likely to be critical about the information that they're consuming. People have a finite amount of mental resources, which can be quickly exhausted when they're overloaded with a lot of information in a short period of time. There is no one easy silver bullet solution to this problem. It is massive and very complicated. Safeguarding the public against the spread of Russian disinformation needs to be a multifaceted, community-driven effort. Since the problem can be understood as large-scale social engineering, this calls for drawing upon the InfoSec community's practices in safeguarding against social engineering. Public awareness campaigns on Russian information operations can go a long way toward alleviating the problem. It is particularly important that efforts to raise public awareness reach members of the press. Media outlets should consider creating new policies outlining better ways to deal with leaked information and sources with adversarial motives. Outlets publishing information should practice data provenance, consider who leaked the information, why they leaked it, and whether or not it's ethical to publish. A key question journalists should ask themselves is, am I furthering a nefarious narrative? Such considerations would make it less likely that attackers could abuse transparency as a value for their own gain. Based on personal experience, exposure to other cultures helps break you out of echo chambers and makes you less vulnerable. Disinformation worked on me because I had isolated myself from my own perspective for long enough, and I did not yet know enough about the Russian government's motive and perspective. Those who understand a range of motives and worldviews are better protected. Different people have different perspectives, and understanding those perspectives increases the likelihood of safeguarding against social engineering. Спасибо за внимание. Thanks for listening. So, quick caveat before we get into questions. I'm not here to talk politics, so if you have a question of a political nature, I'd ask that you hold it until after the presentation, and I'd be happy to talk to you on a one-on-one basis. Thanks again, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Yes?
As we've seen with multiple things like the DNC hacking, the operation of bots within social media, it's not just the Russian government, but also Russian crime organizations that work hand-in-hand with the government. Do you think that they're running their own agenda when it comes to these social ops, or do you think that they're working hand-in-hand with the government as well?
They in this question being the crime organizations?
The crime organizations in the annexation of Crimea.
Well, I think that in this case, the crime organizations are working hand in hand with the government. So I don't think they necessarily have their own agenda other than like being given the. Because basically, what happens, as far as I understand, and I haven't looked at this in depth, but as far as I understand, Russian criminal organizations, those like cyber criminals, are given pretty much free rein to attack other countries as long as they leave Russia alone. And in return, they are expected to help the government when they're called upon to do so. So I think that in this case, the operation was supported by such groups, but I don't think they necessarily had their own agenda in doing so. I think that I answered your question. Back there in the middle? Yeah.
So, I missed the first few minutes, but in the end you talked about confidence, and this is a question personally for me. It's hard, right? You watch a lot of television, like even on the Western side of media, and there's always disputes about making sense about that political.
I'm sorry, can you speak up? I can barely hear you.
I can also stand.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Who knew? Like, I know, right? So, I just had a problem because in a former life I spent a lot of time in the Persian Gulf. I knew a lot of people who worked with Al Jazeera, and you, in different parts of the presentation, you talk about RT. There are ostensibly private news organizations, and they're throughout the world. This isn't just Russia and the US, it's all a lot of international organizations, a lot of nations, and a lot of privatized media outlets. The extent to which those are actually informed by state policy. Because when I would talk to people who work with them, a lot of them don't really understand the divide between whether they are a neutral private entity in their own eyes, who they work for, like Al Jazeera or press TV, and I might personally just want out of that. But did you find a lot of information in your research about direct government instruction on how they deal with media organizations and inform them? Because I guess the dividing line for me is, in my own perspective, when I watch US news, to what extent do we worry about moronic citizens as we feel them because they clearly align with different political agendas and they use their influences in media outlets to do something with that, or ones that are actually being directly instructed by government agencies and officials in an official capacity?
Okay, so basically you're asking to what extent is RT directed by the Russian government?
But in general, in your research, I'm sure RT is the only outlet. And this is a pattern I've seen where, especially in the ones I personally experience with, they're private organizations run by people who are very close with the ruling regime. So how officially they align with the official government line is either personal opinion or someone's directly instructing them. And I think, like, when we have Western U.S. media outlets, how concerned are we that, like, someone just happens to kiss the ass of people who run our government now versus someone in the government is directly instructing that? And what evidence we find to dictate my opinion on the sincerity of what they report on? Or bad journalistic integrity, so that's totally different.
Yeah, I mean, I have not really researched other outlets besides RT, so I can't really speak to that with in an informed manner. So I won't really address that part of it. But in terms of RT, I mean, they receive direct support from the Russian government and funding, and they are directly dictated. Their editorial line is directly dictated by the Kremlin. I mean, this is not an independent media organization. This is Russian state propaganda in the fullest sense of the phrase. I would encourage you, if you're interested in issues of media independence and those sorts of things, I would really encourage you to read this book by Peter Pomerantsev. It's called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and it takes a really in-depth look at Russian propaganda and all of the machinations behind it in terms of how the Kremlin dictates that editorial line and basically some of the tactics that are used. But yeah, like I say in the slide here, a lot of what I talk about in this presentation was informed by that book, so I really highly recommend it. Yeah.
Hey, I really like the point you made. You were saying that we put too much emphasis on fact-checking, and I think that when you said fact-checking assumes agreement on shared sources of truth was a really point way of putting it. I guess my question is, what do you think the alternative is?
What's the alternative? Yes, that's a really difficult, I mean, like I said, the problem is really massive and really complicated, so there's no one easy solution to it. And, I mean, there is a place for fact-checking. It's just that I feel there's a lot of outlets in the West that focus almost exclusively on fact-checking, and that's not a good way to deal with it because, again, it just spreads the false information around more. Like, for example, the European Union has something called Disinformation Review. It's a newsletter that they put out, and it's almost exclusively fact-checking various claims in the Russian media. And it's like, well, okay, I didn't even know that narrative existed until you pointed it out to me and told me that they're telling this blatant lie. And if I were not, if I were not inclined to think that the EU was a, arbiter of truth, then I would dismiss it outright, and the fact check would be completely null, basically. So that's my point, basically. And in terms of what's the alternative, I really think public awareness campaigns and trying to spread education about what is going on here and what the Russian government's motives and perspective is, because I just think that as Americans we typically just don't understand enough about those types of issues to really insulate ourselves from this type of influence.
I think you sort of asked us to draw an analogy from the InfoSec community of social engineering to Russian propaganda or information operations. And so I want to draw an analogy back from the building awareness slide you had. And that seems like the way that we do phishing education, right? Which to me seems to have had very limited effectiveness for our customers. So I wonder if the building awareness stuff will also have limited effectiveness. And to me, the most effective stuff for phishing has been the technological innovations like Keim, email signing for SSL, so email transfers. And I just don't know sort of what technological aspects we can apply to this problem, the Russian IO problem.
Yeah.
And I guess it's more of a question for the community is, are there more analogies you can draw from InfoSec beyond this?
I think you make a great point. I think there is definitely more that can be done on the technological front. I mean, I'm definitely not the person to suggest those types of solutions. It's not my background and not my area of expertise. But I think that there's a lot more that could be done to fight bots on social media, for example, to put measures in place to better prevent the types of abuse we saw from the Russian government on Facebook, for example. There's more that can be done, and I think that social media companies are reticent to try new solutions and to try to innovate in this area. And I mean, Facebook in particular has seemed to say that, oh, our ads weren't effective, but at the same time, like, that's their whole business model is advertising. So obviously their ads are effective in influencing behavior, but at the same time they're claiming that it's not effective. And I think that they have a lot more responsibility than they've taken in terms of trying to make sure that their system isn't abused for ill purposes, really. So yes, short answer is yes, I do believe that there are more technological solutions out there that need more exploration. Yeah?
So what are your suggestions really at a local and a personal level? You got a crazy cousin.
Oh, yeah.
Bob is crazy because Bob's source of news is the Facebook. And so how do you suggest engaging in not a counter narrative, but just subtle steps to help Bob or Pat get over their Facebook feed?
That is a great question. I think it's about having one-on-one conversations, really, and trying to approach that person from a standpoint of empathy. And because every single person has their own biases and their own preferences in terms of where they get their information. And if, maybe you happen to like, I don't know, MSNBC or something like that, but your uncle likes Fox News. You have to understand that there are reasons why people turn to these particular sources, and have, just not starting the conversation from a point of view of, oh, you're absolutely 100% wrong, like you should never turn to Fox News, that sort of thing. Because then the person will just shut down and not have any regard for anything that you say further, really. They'll just, dig in their heels, and that'll be the end of the conversation, basically. I don't know if that answers your question. That's a really, really tough one.
It's hard, right?
Yeah. Yeah, way in the back.
You mentioned RT seems to be more of a targeting external audience, external to Russia. Can you talk at all on how any of those kind of internal on channels to Russia internally?
whether obviously pre-90s or they were state controlled. Can you talk at all a little bit on the internal and national change in Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. So the propaganda inside of Russia is just as strong. There are several state-controlled TV news channels that are trumpeting the Kremlin line 24/7. So, and that was one of the reasons. I mean, a lot of what I told you about the narratives of the little green men and the polite people and the historic reunion and, you know, the return to Russia, all of that, all of those narratives came from the state-controlled domestic TV programs. So that gives you a sense of just how insidious the propaganda on those outlets really is. Yeah.
Just wondering, from like the perspective of consolidation of like news media and things like that, like sort of how we're seeing now in the United States of like Sinclair Broadcasting and Disney Fox, if there's sort of like a parallel, I guess, on like the Russian side, and if that is something that is having an effect on sort of the propaganda machine, things of that nature.
Yeah, I think that you hit on something that really concerns me. In our U.S. media environment, like you said, there is a lot of consolidation going on now, especially with local TV news being bought up by Sinclair, like you said,
right,
which has a very specific editorial line that they've been given. And they have specific programming that they absolutely have to run. And all of those things are messages that people don't necessarily understand where those messages are coming from,
right,
because they're watching what they think is local TV, but what they're really watching is a dictated editorial line. So that phenomenon is very, very concerning to me, because to me, yes, you hit on it. It actually parallels what happened in the 1990s with Russian TV and independent media in general became completely swallowed by this propaganda apparatus. And that's something that is just really has insidious effects, as I've, again, personally experienced.
Sure.
So I hate to stick to our script too, and it's not propaganda, I swear, but we got another class right now. I do have a coin to present to you as a speaker.
Thank you.
And hopefully everybody had a good time. But yeah, there's a whole class outside, so get the floor.